right, so this is activity number 3. In this activity, I am working with the Entity Framework Core, which is an object relational mapper. And that is basically mapping the domain model to the data model, which is simplifying interactions with the database and allowing the focus of the application. So I did create a .gitignore file in the previous assignment, and I am still currently in the activity 3 branch that I created earlier. So the first thing that I did in this assignment was basically using the Entity Framework Core, or EF. So essentially that is writing the domain model as entity first, which is in turn used to auto-generate the database. So to do that, we started by creating a value entity and domain. So going to the root of the domain folder, I did create, it looks like, a class called value.cs here. And I need to check on if I'm using any additional things up here, because it only pulled in using system, and I think that's part of the problem of what I'll show you in a minute. But essentially just putting some getters and setters here. Okay, and this class is representing the value entity, essentially is what this is. So I did create, it looks like, installing entity framework packages in persistence. So there was, it looks like, 2 lines of code to write in the command line down here, basically installing the Entity Framework Core and using the .NET CLI, which I installed the Entity Framework Core .SQLite. So my only issue with that is that it did not, I still don't have that SQLite. So I'll see if I can run that one more time. 1 second. .NET add package Microsoft .entity framework core .SQLite -v 2.26. Yeah, I got an error here. Package, add package. Okay, so I'll put that in the help section of the class in the discussion board and see if I can get some help with that line of code. But I was able to install the Entity Framework Core. Okay, then moving on, create a DB context in persistence. So I do have a new class file that I created called datacontext.cs. And this class should extend the DB context. So that's essentially in this code here. Essentially there is, looks like 3 methods, but using 2 so far. And I have this mock code right here just to show something in the database. But like I said earlier, I can't even see the database because I'm having trouble. It's kind of like migrating the entity or something. I'll get to that part of the instructions. So we did that. Okay, so now the next step is to install Entity Framework packages and API. So in the API folder, What does it say? Before we can use any EF functionality in the API project, we'll need to install 2 EF packages as we did in the persistence project. So that was the Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core.SQLite. I think that's where my problem is that I'll show you. So from the terminal in the root, we're basically running those same 2 lines of code that I had earlier. I only did one down here because I just wanted to try it to see if I'll get an error, which I did. This, and then there's one other one that's not SQLite. Okay, so then the next step is to use our data context class in the API project. Our API will use the data context to communicate with our database. As such, we'll add the data context to our API as a service. Services are added in the API startup CS file. So in the startup CS file here that I have, in the configure services method, let me see where I can find that. Okay, so this is the configure services method here. I need to add a using statement for Entity Framework Core, which I believe I have up top, using Entity Framework Core using Microsoft. Okay, right here. I have it, and okay, and in the app settings.json, create the default connection. I did do that earlier, so that's essentially what is being asked in the connection strings. And default connection, we have data source blogbox.db. Okay. And this is just screenshots of what it needs. I'm just reading through the instructions on my phone. Okay, so then create an EF migration to generate the database. So this is where I had, noticed that I had an issue. So now creating an EF data migration to generate our database. From the terminal in the root folder, use the .NET CLI to create the EF data migration. Running the .NET EF migrations, add create DB -p persistence, and then the -s API. So I did run that, and I'll just type it in really quick so you can see the issue that I had earlier. Okay, .NET EF migrations, add create DB -p persistence. I did spell that right, yes. Right? Yeah. Okay. Dash, and then we have -s, and this is API. /. Okay, so I received this error, this could not execute error. And because of that, essentially, I do not have any migrations sitting in my persistence folder because of this. And I believe it's kind of starting out with those 2 commands that I ran earlier that I also had an error with. So I'll have to do some investigative work as to how to get that to work. But essentially, this is basically a migration, is from what I understand. So if that did work, we would have created an EF migration, which could be used to generate the database. However, we first need to add code to our startup project to run migrations, the DB context from the data context class from which that is derived. The DB context will check for the existence of a database. If a database is not present, the DB context will create it using the create DB migration. So For the further instructions that go on with this project are, well, this activity is mainly talking about the migrations that I do not currently have because of this error that I need to figure out, which I'll get to that later, but I just wanted to show what those errors were. If I did not have an error, what I could have done also is I could have went to the API folder, which I'm currently in. I could have went to the blog box dot, where is it? Run the API project. Blogbox.db. Yeah, okay, it looks like I don't have that either. There's supposed to be a blogbox.db file that I don't have. Okay. Well, essentially, I would have been able to see the database if I had this working. The remaining steps, again, is talking about running the EF migration, viewing the seed data in the database, and that is it. So I basically stage commit and push the changes up to GitHub. Let's see here, ITDEV-162. Okay, so this is essentially what I already pushed up earlier today. And I clearly have the activity 2, activity 3 branches. So like I said, I'll do some investigative work to see how to resolve those issues. But that is it for activity number 3.